In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, the final lesson in your book, as the Apostle Paul finishes up this particular letter, a letter that basically was in response to a lot of questions that had been asked by different ones. The book, I think, has a lot to do with how you deal with division, how you deal with opinions, how you deal with false doctrine when that is part of the problem. And I think that these divisions were in many ways maybe more common then than we would think about today because of the law of Moses and the Jews that were so committed and dedicated to that. And now they are being told and asked to make this change. They should have been aware of what the prophets had talked about in reference to the coming of Christ and the New Testament, the New Covenant. But for many of them, that was a very difficult transition. It was hard for them to imagine that the law of Moses was fulfilled or done away with. And then you have that Jew-Gentile clash, and that they just really, you might even say, hated one another in many areas. And you bring in the Samaritans, who were a mixed race, Jew and Gentile. They'd come about because of Nebuchadnezzar and others that had come in and destroyed the land and had moved people away and brought people in. And thus there was a marriage many times between the Jews and the Gentiles. So you had the Samaritans, and they really were despised, particularly by the Jews. So when you bring all of that in, which way you motoring this morning, man? That way? Going on the traffic jam. Don't get run over this morning.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, be sorry.
Sorry for interrupting your lesson, please continue.
Make you a path there. So you have all of that brought together here, I think, to this particular chapter. And of course, he begins here in chapter 16 by talking about the contribution. And although I don't see anything here that would suggest that there was particularly a problem there, but there may have been in reference to those that were wealthy compared to those that were poor. You remember we did have the problem with the Lord's Supper and how that some folks were being left out. Back to chapter 11, and those that had money, had food, they sort of mixed the Lord's Supper with a common meal. And some folks had nothing, and some folks had everything that they wanted. So there was an issue between the wealthy and the poor. And when you go all the way back to the beginning of the church, in Acts chapter 2, you find that there was a great need at that point for those that had to assist those that had not. And Paul is talking here particularly about a contribution for those of Judea, and that there may have been a famine. We know that there was a famine at one point that was predicted or prophesied. The problem might have been the fact that some of these folks had stayed in Jerusalem, maybe moved their families there because of the allegiance to the church. We know that there was a particular need, going back to Acts chapter 2. But what this did is it brought in a need for a Gentile church, basically the Corinthian church, primarily Gentiles, their need to support a Jewish basic church. And again, because of the way that the Jews particularly treated the Gentiles, many times in the past, you can that, they were really challenged to have this love for somebody that maybe had been very abusive, maybe had treated them like they were no better than an animal, or neglected them altogether. So, all of this brings it back to the importance of generosity, and also for us to think about our giving. And how that we are to contribute or to help others, as well as deal with the expenses that a congregation would have.
But isn't there a story about a Samaritan helping a Jew when the Jew was real sick?
Yeah, the story of the Good Samaritan, yeah. There's a lot of lessons that were used, parables that were told,
Yeah.
in reference to this problem between the Jew and the Gentiles. And it was, Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. Here was a Gentile. Not only was he a Gentile, but he was a Roman centurion. So he worked for the enemy, so to speak. The Jews did not like the Romans, maybe mostly because of the taxes that they had to pay. So as you start looking through the New Testament, a little story about Zacchaeus. He was a tax collector, so there was a hatred, I guess, towards him. On and on you could go about lessons that are taught in reference to the problem of prejudice, the problem of not, getting along. We're bombarded today by this inclusion, and of course we are bombarded by the pressure to include those that are living in sin or practicing sin. And so there's a challenge for us to love folks regardless of who they are or what their lifestyle may be. We must always be loving. We must always be kind. But at the same time, we are pressured just to throw out truth, which obviously we cannot do that.
But there's limits to everything.
There's limits to everything, yeah. And I think that as we deal with that, we have to be careful that we are not making those limits or those opinions law. And he's going to deal, I think, a little bit with that in this lesson as well. Anybody else with a thought there? Okay, we'll go to the questions on page 122. I doubt we'll deal with very many of these because I want to get back to this, center our class on those first 4 verses of 1 Corinthians as he talks about the giving. But as we get into this, there was a problem in Judea. They needed help. Paul had gathered monies from other places as well to go to Judea. We don't know, again, if it was the famine that was mentioned in Acts 11. Maybe it was persecution that had caused this particular problem, persecution against the church. We know that was a reality with Saul in Acts chapter 9. And there was a need for them to share, and the sharing may not have had a great deal to do with rich or poor, but it was just a willingness for those that had to sort of balance the table a little bit and help others. What other congregations did Paul instruct regarding this contribution? Question 1. Yeah, churches of Galatia. And, we have the letter of Galatians, but there were letters that were written, and they were general or they were circulatory letters. The Philippians and Colossians, are 2 examples of letters that were not written to a particular person. They were addressed to certain congregations in those cases, but there are things that are said in those letters that seem to indicate that they were shared those letters. They were circulatory. We don't know exactly how many congregations were in Galatia, but if you've got a map there in the back of your Bible, you might, that's what I did, flipped over there and looked. It doesn't tell you exactly, how many congregations there may have been, but you probably recognize a couple of places at least that are mentioned in the Bible, and that where we know that Paul stopped at, or Timothy or Silas, someone worked there. And but I think the point of this lesson is to point out that what Paul is going to say here about the contribution applied not only to the Corinthian church, but to all the other churches as well. So it was a general law or command teaching them to think about others, to not be selfish, to recognize the seriousness of this issue, and to let us know how it's to be handled. How do we handle money? There have always been really issues with that. There have been congregations that have split over that. There was I say who's here this morning. I think I can say this. There was a congregation not too many miles away from us, had a problem here back a few months ago because one of the elders had gotten pretty elderly, and he was the treasurer, but actually it was his wife that was taking care of everything. And he was no longer able to do that. This congregation knew they had money, but I don't think they really knew what they had or did not have. And they were trying to hire a preacher, and this particular lady basically, I guess, didn't want to do that. And so it took a series of meetings. Again, there were elders, but this one was not able anymore, so they had no elders. And but they got it all worked out, I think, and they were able to get the money situated and get somebody else taking care of it. And it wasn't that this lady was just, per se, I think, trying to do wrong. I think she was probably just trying to protect it. She had handled it for so long, even for her husband, that she was fearful, I think, of it being wasted or being abused. But last I heard, they had gotten it worked out. Probably all of us that have been in the church very long can have a story of issues over money and how the money is to be spent. And one of the things that causes that, I think, is that there are many areas there for opinion. We're supporting several missionaries here, but we have to pick which ones. It's an opinion as to this missionary or that missionary. There are so many things that we spend money on that aren't in that area of opinion. Now, we are commanded to preach the gospel. It's money to do that. We are to help orphans and widows. There are areas where we are given generic authority to help in those areas. But it is not specific as to how much, when, or maybe even to pick which area we want to spend the money in. So it really can be challenging. Paul told the Corinthians to give of their means on which day?
First day of the week.
Okay, first day of the week, as it's mentioned here. And that's interesting in the fact that this ties it, in one sense, to the Lord's Supper. As they assembled, Acts 20 and verse 7, on the first day of the week to break bread, to partake of the Lord's Supper. So we have an emphasis on the first day of the week. John, in the Revelation, puts an emphasis on the Lord's Day, the first day of the week. So, we come together, and this was something that was to be done on that particular day as well. You have the Greek word kata, and I know it's probably not right, C-A-T-A. Is that close, Tom? The Greek word kata, and that is here. The idea is every first day. Is the reason I bring that up. And every week has a first day, so this had to do with observing what Paul was talking about here, and to realize the need for consistency, and to be aware of the fact that this was not just a suggestion, but this was a command that was given. In verses 3 and 4, Paul touches on some ideas, I think, that let us know that this is something that needs to be handled very, very carefully. There need to be those that have a good reputation, that are caring for the contribution, that everything is above board, that there are no real questions about the money and what it's being used for and not used for, and also to realize that in certain areas it definitely is in that area of opinion. Basically, I think what he's going to do here is he's going to talk about the why, the when, who, where, all of those things are issued there. And I want to deal with that at this point, and I say that to say we may not get back to, well, let me do it this way. Is there any question from that point on, or thought there in the rest of those questions that anybody particularly had a comment about or a question about?
I do.
Yes.
Addressing Tata Man's outcome each and every first day of the week. The systemic issuance there, or the mandate, I guess you could say, to incorporate that into what they were doing. How do we address those that would minimize that? The question of whether or not, what if you're blessed, as you have been prospered? What if you're a teacher and you're blessed once a month? Is that, I know this seems petty, but trust me, it's not something that many congregations have struggled with, because sometimes you'll write one check a month out of your prosperity, okay? To me, it would seem by the language here that Paul incorporates it into the acts of worship, where there's a remembrance of a sacrificial giving and purpose for it that goes beyond giving up your means to support the church as you have been prospered. It would seem to me that it becomes something that your mind would need to reference as part of worship, for worship to be fulfilling and pleasing to God. That's my point of view. Now, let's just put that out there. But this was a big debate at school preaching one time, because the as you have been prospered was put up, you took that position, or you took the Kata Main Sabbath, which is each and every first day of the week. So how do you feel about that, or should it even be a thing?
Okay, it's good point, good question. He does deal with the when here. Let me make that note, and then I'll turn it back to Ian. You've got a question there. Of course, this is verse 2, upon the first day of the week. 1 Corinthians. So on the first day, obviously, is what he's saying here. Already noted that if you look at the Greek, the idea is there the first day of every week we are to lay by and store. Depending on which translation you're using, there are different ones that will actually put that into the text itself. And Paul makes it plain that this is an obligation. This was not a suggestion here. It was a command for them to do, to observe, just as they were to observe the Lord's Supper on the first day of every week. This, I think, would apply to us, sort of to add on top of what Tom is saying, even when we're not present. Even if I'm sick at home or I'm on vacation, there's still, if I've been prospered, then there is that obligation to lay by and store. The same as there is that obligation to partake of the Lord's Supper, if indeed we are able to do that. And so a portion, particularly a liberal portion, belongs to God. Actually, all belongs to God. But we are given the opportunity, we are given the privilege, we are by command to lay by in store. Now, one of the things that it was pretty common in that day that people got paid every day. And so there are some of the parables that you look at. You remember the parable where the man, he hired somebody at 9 o'clock in the morning, and he hired somebody right almost at the end of the day, and he paid them. And there was that controversy over the amount there. But that was pretty common for them to do that. Today, all sorts of ways. As we look at some of this bunch, several of us are already at that point where the Social Security and that type of thing, and you get that check once a month. There are a lot of other folks that you get paid monthly. Some of us do. In fact, who in here gets paid weekly? Weekly. So 1, 2. Okay, it's 2. Okay, every 2 weeks. You may every 2 weeks. Okay, 3. Once a month. Okay, that's kind of evened out. You know, there. If you didn't raise your hand, you don't get paid. Hey, you finish your job. Yeah, I suspect Ed does a lot of mowing and that type of thing too. So, you know, you get paid, you know, at different times. Now, the question Tom brings up is interesting. I've been involved, and maybe you have too. In fact, you know, Libby and I, we've looked at this as to how we have always contributed each week. Not so much as we felt that we absolutely had to do that, even though we may not have got a check that week. But there's also appearance that comes into this picture as well, where as we assemble together, it's not that you hold your money up here and drop it in the plate. It is a private thing as well. But at the same time, there is the appearance. Anybody here feel real strongly about this idea? As to how you go about that, even if you don't get paid but once a month? Or maybe even stretched out, more than that. Yeah, just divide it up. Clint, I imagine your pay is interesting too, isn't it? As far as the job?
Yeah, we get a check once a month from our job. But you know, God has always required the very best. And so with that, you know, he set aside the firstborn. And then, you know, God requires the very best from us. And so we should all set aside our gifts weekly, because God, He's commanded it here in 1 Corinthians. And so, you know, as I look at things, God has always required the very best from us. And you know, God's shovel is always bigger than mine.
Yeah, I'm here. There's no illustration. Guy says, I shoveled it out, and the Lord shovels it back in, and His shovel's bigger than mine. Yeah, I think that's a neat illustration, you know, of a fellow that maybe didn't have a whole lot. Okay, I don't know that we're, let's back up a little bit, and then I'll come back if you got another thought. The why of giving is what I wanted to look at.
You know, Jesus talks about the widow that gave her the 2 mites. She gave all that she had. And the others were putting in out of their abundance.
Right.
But Jesus, you know, talked about the widow putting in all that she had.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're not commanded per se to do that. I think we all probably remember the rich young ruler who came and wanted to know what he needed to do. And the Lord said, keep the commandments. He says, I kept those. So he was very religious. You know, he observed the old law that he lived under. But the Lord knew his heart, and the Lord knew that, you know, his money was more important to him than it should have been. And it says that he went away sorrowfully. The Lord didn't tell everybody to do that and go and, you know, get rid of what you got and give it to the poor. Although that is a part of this story, this illustration in 1 Corinthians 16. I guess that, you know, everything that we've said, I think, is correct. But there is that area of a person having to determine, you know, the particular amount, and also whether or not a person does that on a weekly basis. If someone comes to me and asks, I have been asked this, you know, my advice has always been, do this on the first day of the week. You know what that check is going to be most of the time, except I know Jim's job, and I don't know if anybody else, and maybe Clint, you know, so you may not know exactly, but you can guesstimate that pretty good. And if you do that, regardless of whether you're paid, you know, once a week or every 2 weeks or by the job, you can know that you are laid by and stored. What you can then do is, if it ends up being more, then maybe on that fourth Sunday, you know, you could add to that. But if you don't purpose it and you don't plan it, then likely we're not going to give what we really should. And there may be backsets, actually, too, where a person maybe can't contribute as much as you want him to contribute. So all of that comes in here. But the why, it was something that was ordered. We find that this was something that Paul charged them to do. So giving is a command of God. And we've been dealing with the when. There'll probably always be some questions about that. But I do think that there is no doubt that if you and I contribute on the first day of every week, as best we can, looking even if we're not, a lot of us with the Social Security and retirement, you pretty much got that dollar amount. Others of us may have jobs that deal with overtime or special circumstances, and you may have to adjust to that. The who, he says, let each one of you whether they were rich or poor. I made this statement many times that, this is one area where everybody can contribute. If you're making $1,000 a week, you can put in. But if you don't have a dollar, you can put a dime or a quarter of that dollar in. This is one of those that everybody can participate, and it's not based upon a set amount, but it's based upon what we have. And this is a very personal thing. Allowing each of us to contribute, and we mentioned that this poor widow, wouldn't you have loved to have known how the Lord blessed her with that? She may have still been a very poor widow, but it makes you wonder, how did she eat? How did she get along? I have no doubt that the Lord took care of that, but her faith was so strong. And as Jesus pointed out, and as Clint mentioned, the others were giving out of their abundance and probably were not sacrificing the way that she did. Then you have the word of the giving. It was to go into the treasury. The expression lay by in store literally means to put into the treasury. We know that that was the case because he goes on to say there be no gatherings when I come. If we say laid it up at home, you have a place to put your money, and some have done that, and I guess maybe some still believe that that's the way they should do it. I think that expression proves that it is the treasury, and we contribute, and it's there, so when a need arises, then we have the money in the treasury to take care of whatever the obligations may be. And then the what, the amount, as God has prospered, that comes down to each of us looking at that. One guideline is the fact that under the old law, they were given a tenth, and we live under a better law. So I think that's a good starting place to look at what you make, what you have, determine what a tenth would be, and then go from there. If we're not giving at least a tenth, I think that we would have to really question whether or not our giving really is liberal. He says, and Paul talks about this particular 2 Corinthians, evidently they were still having some issues with Paul's next letter in reference to their giving, but it was to be generous, it was to be planned, it was to be liberal, and it was to be on the first day of the week, so he gives some guidelines. Okay, in the next couple of minutes, anybody else with a thought there?
But back then, the church ran the government, so if you gave to the church, you were giving to yourself, really. The church ran the government for the community. So like the Amish community we were talking about on Wednesday, that's how they run their communities, is giving to the church.
Yeah, there are different.
There was a system of benevolence.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
That still exists.
Okay. Okay. Anybody?
I just want to add one thing to my question, or what?
I know we didn't answer it, but
Well, it did, I think, but I feel like the scripture clearly states in various places that Paul wanted to incorporate the idea of sacrificial giving into the worship weekly. Now, the amounts and whether you're prosperous once a month and you split that up, all that is really not as important, I don't think, as the idea of that it needed to be incorporated as an act of worship, as a thought that you did weekly, just like with the communion, just like with your prayers, just like to address that, whether what the amount would be or how you do your math or whatever it is. Don't just address that once a month. don't just address that every 8 weeks if you're paid for a job. Address it weekly, and I think that that's the overarching principle there in that instruction, is that it needs to be part of the worship.
Yeah, I agree, and I think, we realize that if our heart is not in the Lord's Supper, then we're just drinking juice and eating bread. If our heart really isn't in our singing, in our praying, I think sometimes maybe we don't look at money the same way, but it must be, and I think that's the point that is made here, as well as in other places. It's a privilege, it's an honor, it's something that we get to do, and we all need to realize that. Okay, I know there's so many other things here, but we'll move on. Ezra and Nehemiah, the next quarter, Matthew's going to be teaching the class this next quarter, and so we look forward to that. I think also next week is Vacation Bible School, so I think the ladies will probably be out there with us next week as well. That'll make us look a lot better. So just some of you ladies, we like to have more, so